Imagine this road is a timeline of human history. It stretches back into the past. It doesn't go in a straight line. There's ups and downs, twists and turns, but here in the front of the road, this is where we are today. But as we look back, we can go back into the time of the ancients, the ancient world. And stretching back even before the ancient world, there was a time before all the ancient civilizations that we know of that I like to call the deep ancient. The earliest civilizations we know of are already inheritors of technologies and common patterns which came from something even older. And we can see this in the myths. I've talked about this in other videos. The earliest civilizations that we know of are already using the same mythological patterns based on the stars, a fully developed, mature system of profound spiritual insight and wisdom that's already present in the earliest myths and earliest artwork of ancient Egypt, ancient Sumer, ancient India, ancient China, all the earliest civilizations acknowledged by conventional history. That time, way back before the ancient world, I like to call that the deep ancient time. And the ancients acknowledged that there was something more ancient than them, an even higher age before them. And many ancient civilizations around the world talk about a golden age. Maybe that's part of this deep ancient time where things were different. And we'll talk more about a golden age in subsequent videos. But there was some kind of catastrophe that separated the ancient world from the deep ancient world, and there are memories and traditions that talk about that. But what I also like to point out is we can't just focus on whatever that catastrophe was, whether it was a comet or a solar outburst of some sort, or maybe the two went together. There's been a lot of focus on what this catastrophe is and the evidence of this catastrophe around the world, and I am on board with the fact that there was some kind of a worldwide global catastrophe that separates the ancient world from the deep ancient. But we also have to acknowledge that there has been a second catastrophe, a catastrophe that ended the ancient world. And that catastrophe involved the rise of what I call scriptural supremacism. The taking of these ancient myths and ancient stories literally, and the rise of a monotheistic literalism that ended the ancient world, that came about during the Roman Empire and overthrew the ancient understanding of gods and goddesses that were given to the Romans, given to the Egyptians, given to the ancient Greeks. Those indigenous understandings, if you will, were obliterated by the rise of scriptural supremacists who took over and started to stamp out the ancient wisdom that had been preserved in the ancient world, and that was a remnant or an inheritance from a deep ancient culture or cultures even before the catastrophe. Scriptural supremacy brought about the end of the ancient world and led down into the Dark Ages, the loss of technology, the loss of civilization, and the rise of feudalism and basically barbarism in the Dark Ages. And today we're trying to climb out of those Dark Ages, but we still have scriptural supremacy and scriptural supremacists and scriptural supremacism running around, and there are remnants of the Dark Ages that we are still fighting with. Not only that, but the supremacists began generating lies and false history to obscure the record of the deep ancient world. The ancients acknowledged the existence of a deep ancient world and a golden age long in the past, and the ancients talked about a massive catastrophe that separated them. But scriptural supremacists, for whatever reason, some reason that needs to be examined, try to obscure and deny the abundant evidence of the existence of deep ancient and even the existence of a catastrophe. And so if you don't understand this second catastrophe, the rise of the scriptural supremacists, then trying to just focus on the catastrophe and the evidence of the deep ancient is going to keep running into the lies and the false history that continues to be spun to try and obscure humanity's ancient past. What is scriptural supremacism? Scriptural supremacism is taking one set of stories, primarily we're talking about the biblical stories, and saying these are true, everyone else's stories about gods and goddesses are false, demonic, evil, and we have to stamp them out. That is what scriptural supremacism is, and it is totally foreign to the way the ancient world used to operate. In the ancient world, there was an understanding that the different gods and goddesses that were honored by different nations were actually the same gods and goddesses, just with different names, different features, but very similar characteristics. And the ancients acknowledged that. I like to point to the record of Plutarch. Plutarch was an ancient writer. We believe that Plutarch was probably an initiate into the mysteries of the goddess Isis. Plutarch gave us a history of Isis and Osiris. In Plutarch's Of Isis and Osiris, on Isis and Osiris, he talks about the understanding that the gods of Egypt are the same gods that are understood in Greece. They just have different names. He says, most people believe that Amun is the name given to Zeus in the land of the Egyptians. In other words, Amun or Amun-Ra is Zeus, according to Plutarch. And he says they pronounce it Amun or Amun, but that is Zeus. So he equates Amun and Zeus, or Amun and Zeus. And I can show evidence from the celestial foundation of the myths that both Amun and Zeus are based on the same constellation in the heavens. I've talked about that in some of my books, such as The Ancient Worldwide System. Elsewhere in the same text of Isis and Osiris, Plutarch gives this story about Hermes. He's talking about Hermes being enamored of the goddess, consorted with her, later playing at draughts with the moon. He won, that's like a word for checkers, draughts and checkers. Draughts is like the English word for checkers. Playing at checkers with the moon, or a board game with the moon, he won from her the 70th part of each of her periods of illumination, and those are the 5 intercalary days. So he's telling this story. He's saying this is Hermes. That is a story from ancient Egypt about the god Thoth. Thoth and Hermes were understood to be the same divinity. And again, we can see that they're actually the same constellation in the heavens as well. They're the same gods understood as having some different outward appearances and different outward names, but they're the same divine principles, the same patterns. And he shows that again here. He says one of the first acts related of Osiris in his reign was to deliver the Egyptians from their destitute and brutish manner of living. So Osiris was a god who dwelt among men, dwelt among mortals, and taught them civilizing traits. This pattern of a civilizing God who comes and teaches the arts of civilization to humanity so that they won't be brutish and destitute, living in basically, destitute existences. This pattern of a civilizing God is found in the myths around the world. And Plutarch says, well, from these patterns, from these characteristics of Osiris, the Greeks came to identify him with Dionysus. So it's the actual patterns, the characteristics of Osiris caused the Greeks to understand, they're talking about a god who parallels traits of Dionysus. In fact, both Osiris and Dionysus are dying and resurrecting gods. Osiris is cut up into pieces. They're gods who die and come back. This is a pattern, and the Greeks said, aha, Osiris, that's the same as our god Dionysus. So in the ancient times, it was understood you could use different names, but you were talking about the same gods and goddesses. And we today can still see that. In fact, every single week in our modern language, we have names of the days of the week that show us this ancient understanding that the different gods and goddesses are actually the same. Here's the days of the week in English, of course: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Those names of the days of the week are taken from the different visible planets or visible heavenly celestial bodies which are associated with different gods and goddesses in the myths around the world. Sunday, of course, is the day of the sun. Monday, obviously, is the day of the moon. What about Tuesday? Well, most people know or heard somewhere along the line, oh yeah, Tuesday is named after the god Tu or Tyr. That's a Germanic god, Tu, or the Norse god Tyr. He's a god of war. He's the god who put his hand in the mouth of Fenris or Fenrir the wolf. He was the bravest god, the only one who was brave enough to put his hand in the mouth of the wolf when they were trying to bind this world-devouring wolf. Tyr sacrificed his hand by putting it in the mouth of the wolf. That's what you see depicted there. What about Wednesday? That's Wotan's day or Odin's day, the god Odin. That's what Wednesday is named after. Thursday is obviously named after Thor, the thunder god Thor. And Friday is most likely named after the love goddess Freya. Some people say, oh, it's named after Frigg, the wife of Odin, but probably it's the love goddess Freya, and we'll see why I say that in a moment. And then Saturday is actually named after the god Saturn. That's a Roman god. So we have the name of a Roman god on Saturday. But if you go to Spanish or other European languages that are derived from Latin, you'll find that the names of the days of the week correspond to Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. Sunday in Spanish is called Domingo. That means the Lord's Day. So Sunday, the literalist Christians took over Sunday and called it the Lord's Day. Lunes, obviously that still means the moon's day, lunar in English. Lunes is Monday. Tuesday, in Spanish, they call Martes. Well, who's that named after? Mars, the god of war. So the Roman god of war has the same day as Tuesday, the Norse god of war, or the Germanic god of war. In other words, there's an understanding that these are the same gods. They correspond to one another. Their characteristics are the same. They just have different names. Wednesday is miércoles, and you may think, oh, that's unusual. Who is miércoles? That's Mercury, the messenger god. Mercury is a boundary-crossing god. You might think, well, Mercury, he's a messenger. He can go to different places. He uses words. You might think that's a strange correspondence, Mercury to Odin, but Odin is also a boundary-crossing god. He's the god who discovers the runes. He uses magic. He corresponds to Mercury. Miércoles. So in Spanish, the day of Mercury is in English the day of Odin or Wotan. Thursday, Thor's day, in Spanish is Jueves. Who's Jueves named after? Whose day? That is the day of Jove, Jupiter, Zeus. The thunder god Thor and Jove or Zeus, they are the same god. They have the same characteristics. They are thunder gods. They are sky gods. They are storm gods. They are jolly. They are jovial, but they also have a terrible temper that in a moment they can become very angry. Their characteristics are the same. The ancients understood that Thor and Jove are the same deity. And then Friday is called Viernes. That is the name of the week that belongs to the love goddess Venus. That's why it's almost certainly Friday is named after Freya, Friday, and in Spanish it's Viernes. Now, on Saturday, just like the Lord's Day was taken over by one set of biblical supremacists and monotheistic literalists, the Christians, Sábado, that's Saturn's day, that's the Sabbath. In Spanish, that word sábado means Sabbath day, because one of the gods of the Bible is associated with the constellation that is associated with Saturn. I'll get into that in another video. But the main point here is even our days of the week reflect this ancient understanding from the time of the ancients that the gods and goddesses of different nations, it's not that one is better than the other, they're the same. Odin has the same characteristics as Mercury or Hermes. Thor has the same characteristics as Jove or Jupiter or Zeus. They are acknowledging the same divine gods and goddesses. But when the scriptural supremacists and the monotheists came out, they don't want to acknowledge that the different gods and goddesses are given to the different nations are equally valid. The ancients understood that. This second catastrophe says, no. There's only one name. We can only worship one God. This is a verse from the book of Acts saying, neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. You can only find salvation in our stories, nobody else's. This is a completely opposite point of view. This is an example of scriptural supremacism. Once scriptural supremacists took over the Roman Empire, they stamped out the understanding of the ancient gods and goddesses that had been given to the people of the Roman civilization, or the Greek gods and goddesses that were given to the people of the Greek civilization, or the Egyptian gods and goddesses that were given to the people of ancient Egypt. And then they started going around to Europe after they destroyed the Roman Empire and broke it into pieces, turned it into fiefdoms, and then started going around and converting at the point of the sword other cultures in Europe and in Africa and in parts of Asia and the eastern part of the Mediterranean to this scriptural supremacist monotheistic literalism. And this is a picture of chopping down the Irminsul. When they got enough technology to start crossing the oceans, they went and did the exact same pattern in the Americas. This is a painting from Mexico City. It's a famous set of murals. This is showing the burning of Maya sacred texts by the priests of the Roman Catholic Church in the Spanish. The Europeans came over and started destroying the Maya texts and burning them so that we have very few of the codexes of the ancient Maya remaining to us today. This is an example of scriptural supremacism. And it goes on to this day. I'm not against the Bible stories. The story of Jesus and Mary is beautiful and has power and has things to teach us. The story of Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers, and then the later reunion where he forgives his brothers. It's powerful, it's emotional, and it's moving, and it has profound positive lessons to teach us. But this scriptural supremacism hijacks those stories and twists them into something totally different. This is Michelangelo's Mary receiving the body of Jesus down from the cross. I've pointed out many times before, this ancient story parallels the story of the goddess Isis receiving the body of Osiris. Remember, Osiris is also a dying and resurrecting divine figure, receiving the body of Osiris from the king of Byblos, where Osiris has been put into a coffin, and then a tree grows up around the coffin, and the king takes the tree and turns it into a pillar to support the roof of his palace. And Isis, looking all over the world to try and find Osiris, finally finds out about Osiris's body being encased in this tree that got turned into a pillar. And then here she is receiving the body, or receiving the tree, the pillar, containing Osiris. Look at the parallels here. This is from an ancient Egyptian artwork from the temple at Abydos. I've pointed this out before. The distinctive extended arm of Mary that you see here, and the distinctive extended arm of Isis as she receives the body of the dying and resurrecting Osiris, that indicates a specific constellation in the heavens. That shows that Isis and Mary are associated with the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin, who has a distinctively extended arm in the actual constellation in the heavens. Now, many people today instinctively say, oh, Osiris, of course, he's associated with Orion. We know that. Well, Osiris may, in some instances, be associated with Orion, but as I've argued and shown a lot of evidence in my book, The Ancient Worldwide System from 2019, Osiris is definitely associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is the constellation outlined here. Ophiuchus looks like a central pillar that's holding up a roof. Not only that, but in the Plutarch account, it talks about how Isis wraps him in a winding sheet. You can see the serpent halves on either side of Ophiuchus. Those are the winding sheet, I argue, the shroud that is wrapped around the central pillar containing the body of Osiris. Osiris is associated with Ophiuchus, and so is Jesus. Jesus in the Gospels is definitely associated with Ophiuchus. Now, Jesus is also sometimes associated with the sign of Aquarius, who separates the sheep from the goats, the sign of the Son of Man, but Jesus is mostly associated with Ophiuchus, and Ophiuchus is born of the Virgin. If you look at the constellation Virgo, the Virgin, she looks in the heavens like a woman who is giving birth. She's lying on her back with her legs elevated and spread apart, and if you imagine who is born of that virgin, that would be figures who are associated with the constellation Ophiuchus often. And in fact, if you look closely at the constellation Ophiuchus, you will see how that leads to the story of Jesus being crucified on a cross in between two thieves. The central cross of Ophiuchus makes the familiar form of the Christian cross, but on either side, those two thieves were often depicted in Renaissance art as being crucified on something that doesn't look anything like the classic cross of Christianity. Rather, they're depicted in these very twisted positions. That's because the central body of Ophiuchus on either side are the twisted serpent halves of Ophiuchus. And if you look here, this thief on this side, he has this outstretched arm that's pretty straight. And then this thief on this side, he's holding on to this forked tree. It's almost got a V at the top of it. Let me sketch in that V. Now, if we look back at the constellation Ophiuchus, there's that V right there. The V shape is on this side of the constellation Ophiuchus, and the flat side of Ophiuchus is over here. So if I were to bring in those thieves again, you could see they're reversed from the original painting. But I believe now, after looking at it long enough, that the artist from this painting from the 1600s is depicting the V fork of Ophiuchus. That's the serpent's head of Ophiuchus on the thief on the left as we look at it, and the straight arm, that's the thief on the right as we look at it. The stories in the Bible and the characters in the Bible are based on the stars, just like I've shown for the cultures around the world. It's all part of a worldwide system, a very coherent, very sophisticated, unified worldwide system that almost certainly comes from a deep ancient past that predates even the most ancient civilizations known to conventional history. Predates ancient Egypt, predates ancient Sumer, predates ancient India. But scriptural supremacists want to say, no, only our names are correct and all the other gods and goddesses have to go. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, I've mentioned this quotation in my previous video, but he says, the boast of Christianity and Judaism, that is, monotheistic literalism, the boast of Christianity and Judaism is that they alone have presented to mankind its purest concept of deity in the form of the one God, monotheism. The claim is by no means true as fact. They may more correctly be said to have been the first to present the one God without the ancient train of the subordinate gods. What Alvin Boyd Kuhn is saying is, when you get rid of all the other gods and goddesses, you empty out the ancient understanding, because those gods and goddesses are very important to our present life, to going through life. If you don't understand the different gods and goddesses, whatever name you choose to understand them under, then you have emptied out the ancient wisdom to the point where it becomes, as he says on the next page, an empty cup. You just have an ineffable, untouchable one God, and you've hollowed out all the gods and goddesses that are actually meant to help us understand what is going on our own internal landscape. As we walk through this life, we need to be able to recognize the God of Tuesday and the God of Wednesday and the God of Thursday and the God of Friday and the other gods and goddesses who play a role in our life and who play a role on our inner landscape. And as we're going around through this life, if you empty yourself out of that, it's like you have an empty cup. In fact, it turns the teaching on its head, and that's why we have this morally bankrupt genocide going on. You've got literalist Christians nodding their head saying it's okay, or we have to support that. It's horrific, because the ancient wisdom was hijacked. It was a catastrophe. Spiritual supremacism is a catastrophe, and it is leading to the disintegration of the, quote, Western civilization that was built on top of that scriptural supremacism, that monotheistic literalism that then went around the world trying to stamp out the ancient understanding that was given to all the different cultures of the world. But fortunately, that ancient system is not completely lost. You can go back to the different gods and goddesses that were given to the different nations before this second catastrophe. You can go back to the Norse gods and goddesses. Unfortunately, the scriptural supremacists pretty much destroyed everything we know about the Norse myths, except for a few texts that were written down in Iceland. That's where most of our record of the Norse gods and goddesses was preserved, in Iceland. There are quite a few texts that survived about the ancient gods and goddesses of Greece and of Rome. So we can understand the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome very well. And that may be a source for you to learn about the gods and goddesses. You can choose whichever names you want. That's what I'm trying to point out. We do have a lot of record of the Greek gods and goddesses and the Roman gods and goddesses. So that's one source. Also, the gods and goddesses of India have survived. So the goddess Durga, I show her here alongside Venus and Freya. That's one of the goddesses of India. I've talked about Durga in other videos and extensively about the different gods and goddesses of India in my 2019 book, Ancient Worldwide System. Or Guan Yin, the gods and goddesses of ancient China. So some of these cultures have escaped the smashing of their ancient traditions by the scriptural supremacists. But what I'm saying is, you can choose, but you should go try to learn the different characteristics of the gods and goddesses, because if you ignore them, then they're still present in your life. They're still active on your internal landscape, but you don't know how to recognize them, recognize their positive sides and their more unwelcome or shadow sides, and how to call on them to exhibit their positive sides, the more positive aspects of the different gods and goddesses, whatever names you choose, whichever set of gods and goddesses you choose to study. You can learn their characteristics and how to call upon them for their positive, welcome benefits, and how to recognize when there's some unwelcome sides being exhibited, so that you can recognize that and take steps to ask for the positive side instead. And that is why it's so important to get to know the gods and goddesses, whichever culture's set of gods and goddesses you choose to study, because they're all part of the same system. You could also choose gods and goddesses from the Sumerians. One of the gods of ancient Sumer is Inanna, or in Akkadian and Babylonian she was called Ishtar, or in the Yoruba of Africa, the goddess Oya, or in the traditions of the Pacific, Hine Nui Tepo, or from Japan, Amaterasu, or from the Americas, the moon goddess from the Maya. The point is, we need to learn to recognize the gods and goddesses, and unfortunately, the records from many of those different cultures, from the Americas or from the Norse or from some of the other cultures of Europe, were viciously stamped out and virtually obliterated. The stories of the Bible themselves are also profound and full of positive messages for us, if we learn to reject the position of the supremacists. You can use those stories of the Bible, and I've got 2 whole courses that are about the celestial aspects of the stories of the Bible and how they point to reconnecting with self. You might want to check those out. The different systems that were given to humanity almost certainly come from the deep ancient times, from the golden age. They were given to us for our benefit. This second catastrophe wants to put up lies in a smokescreen to prevent our even understanding that that has happened. But the evidence is becoming more and more clear from all different researchers looking in all different types of evidence. And until we understand this second catastrophe and what it is trying to do to obliterate our understanding of these ancient gods and goddesses, then we're getting a partial picture of what happened. That's why I believe it is so important to understand this timeline and then to go back. Nobody was originally a scriptural supremacist. In the ancient times, all the different nations of the world had their own sacred traditions, sacred stories, gods and goddesses, and understanding. So what I recommend to everyone is to find one tradition and study it and start to get to know those gods and goddesses, because they are still playing a role in your life, whether you are able to recognize them or not. But if we're unable to recognize them, then it's like we have an empty cup, and that's what you're seeing going on with these morally bankrupt supporting of genocide, is because of this empty cup, and the catastrophic effects are becoming so obvious that they're no longer able to even hold things together. So that's why it's so urgent that we understand this message and we turn back to that ancient wisdom and find ways to apply it to our lives, even starting on an individual level. Thank you so much.